so good to see everyone tonight, especially our visitors. We welcome you and so glad that you're here. Also glad for those who are unable to join us here in person or able to join via Zoom. For our visitors, we have been spending the last several weeks now in studying Christian evidences. That is, things that can help us to defend what we believe and why we believe it based upon the Word of God to someone who doesn't respect the Word of God. People who have grown up to believe that the Word of God is nothing but a set of fairy tales. There's no scientific factuality to it. It's not historically accurate. They don't believe that there's anything that you can hold fast to within it. So they treat it like they would Aesop's fables, Grimm's fairy tales, anything like that. So what we have striven to do in this class is to prove from a biblical standpoint and also from an extra biblical standpoint. That is the scientific record and also the historical record, basic facts and truths about the Word of God, about creation, about all of these things that are foundational to our beliefs that will be presented in such a way that is intellectually viable. Since the late 1800s, there has been a rising movement that still today exists in different forms known as the Enlightenment, which was a period of time in which they, at least intelligentsia, academia, the folks in colleges around this country and in other countries as well, to try to separate education and being educated from the spiritual. And so people like Darwin and others, some famous poets and things that we discussed in our early lessons, tried to separate biblical principles from science and history and literature and those things, to the point that it began to lead to what we know as modern atheism today. Evolutionary theory, the Big Bang, things that we've discussed already. And one of the things that we have been discussing in a broader heading over the last few weeks are moral implications of things presented within the Bible. Where did our morals come from? Why do we have a general code of law? Why even in places where Jesus is not known do they find peoples who have a general standard of what is right and wrong? They find people with an inerrant sense and desire to worship something. Where does that come from? We have striven to show that it all comes from an original source, and that original source is being the one true and living God. And over the last couple of weeks, we have dealt with the idea of evil, pain, and suffering. How could a loving God, such as He is, such as the Bible proves that He is, for God is love, John would say in his epistle, how can He allow so much tragedy to happen in the world? Take, for example, what we've seen in the world just over the last year. How many people have lost their lives? How could a good and loving God allow that to happen? How could He allow innocent children to die in droves as they do so often because of decisions made in this country? And on and on and on we could go, giving examples to such things as this. Then last week we looked at, or at least the last time we studied this material, we looked at how could a loving God be loving if He wiped out whole groups of people in the past. Some atheists, some agnostics, those who say we cannot know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God exists, that the things within this book, the Bible, are true. Some would say, how can a loving God wipe out whole groups of people and still be loving? And so we described how love is sometimes attached to punishment. It is a deterrent from doing things which are wrong. And that also applies to justice as well. As merciful as God is, eventually His justice has to win out. We talked about the sin of the Canaanites, all of those groups of people that God mentioned in Exodus chapter 3 when He called Moses from the burning bush to deliver His people up out of bondage in Egypt. All of these people whom He had said to Abraham He would give time, for the time of their iniquity was not yet full. He was loving in that he was disciplinary. He was just in that he is fair to a degree that even we in our human system and human law cannot reach. We have talked about many moral implications for that, but I want to deal with a specific question tonight, one that maybe we haven't thought about a lot. More of an ethical question when it comes to morals, and it will help us to see as technology changes, as science progresses over the next few years and has for the past several decades, what should be the Christian's response to certain things that science is setting forth to do? Because we know that the majority of those who fall on the atheistic scale, they don't have a respect for human life as we do. They do not understand every person as a soul as we do. You look to those who are advocates of the abortion agenda and other things like that, and what will they do? They try to do everything they possibly can to do what? Dehumanize that unborn soul. Why? Because then these things don't sting. Then these decisions don't hurt as much. And so morally, they have tried, really since the victory of Roe versus Wade in 1973, to slowly dull the senses of the populace towards these things, where it is no longer a baby, a child within the womb, it is a fetus. It is an embryo. We try to dehumanize these things. And that's just one instance. We've spent some time talking about that in bits and pieces, and we won't go into great deal tonight, but you see, that creates a moral conundrum for the Christian. Where are we to stand? We've talked about the sanctity of life, that we are to protect the sanctity of life. And so we know that, but there are other scientific areas where experimentation may be done and things may be done to further certain practices that we have to answer things about. And one of those is the question of cloning. Since the mid-1990s, the idea of cloning an adult cell has been possible. I remember sitting in my living room floor as a little boy watching Peter Jennings, of all people. Now granted, remember, I was a little boy. I did not understand the political leanings of any media or anything like that at that time. But I used to love Peter Jennings. I would sit and I would listen to that man talk every single night because I loved his voice. And I vaguely remember seeing the story pop up in 1997 when the news broke that one ewe lamb, adult ewe lamb, had been completely cloned from a cell, an adult cell, the first time that had happened. Now, that was the first time that a fully adult mammal had been successfully cloned. Do you remember, does anybody remember off the top of their head? And I'm just going to ask this is not for points, not for gold stars, I'm just interested if anybody does. Does anybody remember the basic definition from high school of what they classify a mammal as? So that, from an evolutionary standpoint, they also include whom within that species, within that group? Humans. You may remember they are those who contain fur. They produce their young by a certain reproduction practice. All of these things go together to classify one as a mammal, and therefore humans stand within that classification for these scientists. Now here's the question. If they can successfully clone adult rats, as they have, adult sheep, as they have, what's the next step? Logically and from a mind standpoint, the next step would be to say that human cloning would be then theoretically what? Possible. But here's where the moral conundrum comes. Perhaps it is possible. Perhaps they can from their classification. But the question is this: should they? And so, what I want us to deal with tonight, as we look at the moral implications of this idea and how it falls within the spectrum of sanctity of human life, we're going to ask that question. If they can, will they? And if they can, should they? Now, in order to do that, I think we need to begin with a little bit of a basic history of where this came from. I don't know if you were like me, but before I started digging into this, I really thought that this idea of cloning was a rather modern development. 1997, 1998, when these things were really beginning to come upon the scene, is not that long ago for a lot of us. It seems a little bit longer now, but it's not really all that long ago in the scope of things. But truthfully, this idea, at least the hypothesis, which eventually led to that successful endeavor of cloning that ewe lamb in 1997 or so, this idea goes back almost 100 years from that. The basis of the idea of cloning, as we know it today, goes back to 1901, to be exact, when a German embryologist, his name was Hans Spielmann, he was also a professor of zoology at the University of Freiburg. He successfully split two cells of a newt embryo into two distinct parts, all the way back in 1901. Now just imagine the laboratory tools that they had in 1901 when he was able to successfully do this. He split these two cells into two different larvae. Now, take that one success, push it all the way out to the 1950s. There were two men, F.C. Stewart of Cornell University, most importantly, demonstrated that you could also do this not just in newts, not just in these reptile creatures, but also in the vegetable kingdom. And we see this today. He cloned a carrot plant and produced thousands of carrots from that. Also in 1952, there was a man named Robert Briggs and his scientific partner Thomas King of the Institute of Cancer Research in Philadelphia, which still exists today. They were able to take a leopard frog, which is a very specific breed of frog, and clone that leopard frog. And so here are very early examples of this same process being done. But it wasn't until about the mid-1980s where they began to work on this with mice, mainly around 1984 or so, in the same place, actually, the same cancer research facility in Philadelphia. They were looking into being able to do this, perhaps for its potential help in finding a cure for cancer, perhaps finding good cells to replace the bad cells which have been corrupted by such disease. That was the general idea, at least at that point, and that seems good, but there's a lot more to it than that. Really, the research that led up to what we saw in the 1990s began with that. The idea of taking these mice and be able to clone them perfectly. Now that one ewe lamb named Dolly, what was significant about her was that not only did they clone her, but when she was cloned, she was fertile. She was able to reproduce above her own. And so there is a potential of breeding that same line twice over. And this basically leads us to more of the modern idea of what cloning is all about. They were able to do this, and now they were able to continue to clone these adult mammals. That research has continued to grow. In the early 2000s, they did the same thing with cattle, actually, and it became a huge media report that they were able to clone these livestock and produce these livestock, and it was supposed to, what's interesting to me, if you go back and look at the old news reports, which I did, it was supposed to solve the beef problem. As you clone these mammals and they reproduce, it was supposed to solve the beef problem. But here we are now, and what are they all saying? Well, they're all trying to push towards plant-based meats for what purpose? Because the beef population is shrinking, at least as they say, and we have to do something about the consumption of meat. Now here's what they don't tell you, is that these successive generations, both in the Dolly case and in the cattle case of 2001, the successive generations developed defects. They behaved in certain ways that was far beyond what we would consider normal. As these animals were cloned and they continue to be cloned further, it seems as though what? The substance of said animal begins to deteriorate. In fact, it was said of the process right around this time, as they observed these animals, that cloning by nuclear transfer, all that is the exact process that is done to do this, is an inefficient process, in that which most clones die before birth, and the survivors, they display growth abnormalities. Sometimes it can be brain growth, sometimes it can be physical growth in that they come out deformed and such things like that. They're always pushing this idea of the possibility of this, that we can clone mammals, therefore the cloning of humans is just around the corner. But should we? Because look at the quality of life, even with these animals. Some die before even birth, and those that usually do survive are born what? Deficient in some way. So, in truth, if we're going to pose the question, has this, even to the point that it's gotten to now, been successful really? No, not really. Because honestly, it is deteriorating to the point that the quality of life of these animals is more suffering than it is life. Now, here's a philosophical question for us, as we're dealing with the moral implications of what can happen by doing this. Why do they want to prove this so badly? What would, for the agenda of those who seek to erase God from the minds of the people, what would they be seeking to accomplish in being able to do this? Yes, Doug?
They want to prove that science can create life and that it's not necessarily a function of God.
You hit it right on the head. They want to remove God from the picture. Science is the end-all be-all, right? In their mind. Humanity is what? The top of the food chain. There is nothing greater than us, and they want to prove that from their standpoint. That is what the view that they hold. And so if they can make this successful, if they can work this procedure, and it is incredibly detailed, except for the fact that it does seem to devastate the cell at some point. If they can do this and make a successful transition from animal to man, it does exactly what they're hoping to do. removes God from the picture. And if God is removed from the picture, what does that do? They no longer have a higher law to appeal to. They no longer have to defend themselves against those who would stand up for what is right. Why? Because they say, see here, we can take life and create it. But here's my question, and this is something we want to deal with as well. Just from, as we're working through this from a moral standpoint, are they really creating life? You know, we talked about the laws of matter and energy in the beginning of this study as we were showing the fallacies of the Big Bang. Matter can neither be what? Created nor destroyed. So, when you're talking about cloning, are they really creating life, or are they simply shifting life in one direction or another? It's lateral movement, isn't it? They want to prove science is the source of life, but what can it not create? The soul. That spark. Yes, brother. Do you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, okay. I just thought I saw you raise your hand. That's all right. That's absolutely right. They cannot create the soul. You may remember that scientific study I mentioned in one of the early weeks of this class as well, where they have studied under a microscope the conception of embryos to form a child, and how they have been able to find that as those things connect with one another, there is ever so slightly that they can see, they can read, and it has been proven at this point, a spark that happens in that moment. They can shift life, yes. Just as with a simple experiment, we can, on a micro level, in small increments, understand, micro I believe in, small I believe in, we can evolve in small increments. You think about people who live in certain weather environments and things like that, that over time their skin toughens up, or they grow more hair than other humans. Why? On a micro level, their bodies are adapting or evolving to their environment. It's the macro jumps from species to species, monkey to man, that I cannot stand by. But we can see that. We can even experiment with that. And what's interesting from the cloning standpoint is you can do this with a copier. And every time that you do this experiment, it never gets better. It always deteriorates. I'm going to challenge you to do something at home. If you've got a ream of paper and some ink you don't mind wasting, because it is kind of interesting to watch. Get you a book that has a picture in it and run it on a Xerox machine. And when you run that picture, if it's a black and white one, the first copy is what? Going to look exactly like what you pulled off, right? It's going to look exactly like the picture in the book. Now, take that copy of the copy, put it on the machine, and run it off. What's that other copy going to do? It's going to be a little bit lighter than that first copy, isn't it? And the further you go, you can continue that process over and over and over again. And you know what you're going to do, or what's going to happen after about 12 or 15 sheets run through that machine? You're going to go from a perfect copy on the first one, or at least near perfect, to a white sheet again, because it deteriorates over time. That's not because you're running out of ink, but it's what? You're getting further and further away from the source. So I don't deny that cloning is possible, but cloning is not the creation of life. Yes, Dan.
I've got two verses that would speak to that very well.
Absolutely.
Unless you already have them.
Go right ahead. I might, but we'll see.
Well, we'll see first. Zechariah 12. I got one from the Old Testament and one from the New.
Zechariah 12 was the one I was just about to bring up, but I was going to ask somebody to read it. So do that.
Is it okay right now, or if I got
Yes, go ahead, because you got it.
Zechariah 12:1. The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens and layeth forth the foundation of the earth. And here it is. And formeth the spirit of man within him.
Mm-hmm.
And then a companion verse to that I have is James chapter 2, verse 26.
Mm-hmm.
For as the body without the spirit is dead,
Yes.
so faith without works is dead. So what that tells us right there is that you can create a body all day long.
Yes.
As you've already noted, they seem to be corrupted over time. But even if you could form a perfect body, it's the spirit that gives life.
It is the soul. Absolutely. And there is only one source for the soul. You think about what he said to Jeremiah at one point. While you were yet in your mother's womb, I knew you. We are created in the image of God. From the very moment of conception, we exist. And we never cease to exist. This body is going to corrupt. It's going to fall apart, isn't it? The older we get, the more trouble we're going to have with it. Eventually, what happens? It can no longer run, and we die. But what lives on? The soul. The part of you that makes you you. The part of you that is your intellect, that is the part of you that can make decisions. It's the part of you that is your personality and all these things. That comes from that part of you made in the image of God. And that part of you is eternal. Our souls are eternal in one destination or another. That's the one thing they cannot recreate. It is not on man to create life in a test tube, has it? Is it? It never has been. At least not from the standpoint of cloning. Because what was God's command to Adam and Eve? As Dennis is well known to say from time to time, and he's right about this, it's the one commandment that mankind has kept perfectly. What did he say? Be fruitful and multiply. What did Paul tell Timothy about the younger women? That they were to marry, they were to bear children and rule the household. You see, the natural process of life has been God ordained and commanded for all that time. The soul is the only thing that cannot be created or recreated by anyone except God himself. As Doug mentioned, James 2:26, there's also a few more passages I want to mention as we're getting closer to the end here. Do you remember this passage as Paul is preaching there on Mars Hill? You know, that's one of my favorite sections of Scripture. It's one of the best sermons ever recorded. But you remember what he says about God in Acts 17, verse 25. Somebody look that up and read that. Acts 17, verse 25.
Nor is he served by human hands as though he did anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life, breath, and
Life and breath and all things. He is the source of life. You go back to the creation account, it says what? And he breathed into man's nostrils what? The breath of life.
And it further said, and he became a living soul.
Yes.
Not
yes.
a living body, but he emphasizes there, Moses
And
says.
that soul is from God, and it is through that we continue to live. Same passage, drop down a couple of verses, verse 28. In this God, the unknown God to these people, he is the one that we do what? Somebody read that. 17:28 of Acts.
For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring.
What's funny to me is that Paul is quoting a heathen poet there. He's quoting Cleanthes about Zeus. He says, we are the offspring of Zeus. But who is he taking their own words and applying it to? The one true God. And could it be a truer of a saying? Absolutely not. It is true. We are his offspring, the offspring of God. He created us all, and in him we move and live and have our being. You see, so no matter what they can do within a laboratory, with lambs or cattle or frogs or carrots, or you go all the way back to the newt, they're not creating life. They are simply, at the very least, making a chemical Xerox of life. And what usually happens? The further you try to push it out, the more it deteriorates. Why? Because the further they're trying to get away from the source of life. So, we asked two questions here. Can potentially you clone humans? Absolutely. Process exists. But should you? No. Why? There are many reasons. Number one, you cannot circumvent God. Number two, the quality of life of that human being will not be what it ought to be. Why in this country do we have certain laws about marriage and whom within families is able to marry? You know, we joke all the time, or at least folks do a lot of times about us, folks in Alabama marrying cousins. But we don't do that, do we? Why? What's the potentiality there if it was done in such a way? Or worse, in a closer relation.
Genetic disorder.
Exactly. Genetic disorder. Deformity. Yes, go ahead, Doug.
And we see that in history with certain lines of royalty.
Yes. Look at some of these portraits in Europe.
Some of them went slap crazy just because they were disorderly, genetically speaking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you look at some of these portraits, you can even see it in the shape of their faces, their noses, other things. As these lines became more and more bred in that fashion, it always leads to a deterioration and difficulty. Yes. Mental disorder, absolutely it does from time to time.
Well, would a clone human, to me, they wouldn't have any morality. They wouldn't have, if they don't have a soul, how can they have any morality? You're not gonna care what's right.
Well, that's a little bit of a different question, though.
It is. It's a little bit of a different one.
To say
I
that,
see your point. But
I see the point, but that would have to assume that God doesn't put a soul in the clone.
Yes.
And He might do that. Otherwise, they couldn't live, because we just read.
Exactly.
We just read.
Without that soul, it's impossible to live.
We just read in James 5:26 or whatever that a body without a soul is a dead body.
Right.
So they would have to have a soul in order to be animate.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, the physical side of things is deterioration.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting thought, though.
It is.
But we don't know. If a human is cloned, that they don't have, whether they have a soul. We don't know that.
I think from that statement in James, it's almost impossible. Not almost. It is impossible for an animate being, at least a human being, not to have one. Now, you look at the animal kingdom, not created in the image of God. They are animate, but yet I do not, believe that. But still, that is an interesting question.
Well, even animals have the breath of life in them.
Yes, they can live, that's for certain.
That it's been a debated topic within not only the world of Christendom, but even within the church, do animals have a soul?
Right. We know that they have at least enough breath of life to be animate.
They have a soul in them of sorts, or else they
But
could
they're
not live.
not made. But they're
But
not
that's
made in
correct.
the
It's
image
not
of
made in
God.
the
That's
image
what
of
makes
God.
the difference.
That's the difference there.
Exactly.
Else they couldn't live either.
Mm-hmm.
And in Genesis chapter 6, we even read that definitively when God said He planned to destroy everything that lived and had within it the breath of life. And
Yeah.
even that cannot be reproduced by the cloners.
No, it can't. It absolutely can't. So, let's also think about another passage similar to what Paul said in verse 25. Do you remember what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7? Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. And I'm going to pull this up really quickly on mine here so you don't have to turn there. Remember what it says about death in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was. We were created from the dust. Woman was created from the rib of the man. We know that from our creation account. And notice what happens for the spirit. The spirit shall return unto whom? The God who gave it. You see, without God, life is not possible. You can shift the particulars about a certain individual. You could make their hair color the same. You could make their eye color the same. You could potentially clone certain things about their natural abilities and certain things. But life in and of itself cannot be recreated. There is only one source for it, and that is the one true and living God. One thing that's interesting about that to me is too, even with a clone, here's another thing, and this is from a psychological standpoint. You could not recreate the personality either. Because we all come into this world as what? Blank pieces of paper. And based upon what we are taught, the environment in which we are reared, certain things develop within us. Certain tendencies, certain traits. Sometimes we pick them up from parents. Sometimes we pick them up from other relatives, and we spend a lot of time around. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're born with these things, but we develop an aptitude, and we develop our attitudes and personalities based upon these environments that we're around. And sometimes the antithesis happens. Sometimes people grow up in a rather difficult environment, and they make a fully dedicated mental decision to do what? Go against whatever it was. It is possible to break the cycle in those sorts of things. You think about people who've grown up in situations of abuse or drugs and alcohol and all those sorts of things. People who have turned their lives around to be completely different than the environment perhaps that they came from. It's not impossible to do. It can be hard sometimes because we are used to those things in an odd sense. There's a part of us because of trauma and other things that may make us quote unquote comfortable with those things, even though they're not right, or we don't feel safe by them. We're just used to the habit of it. That's one thing you couldn't recreate with a clone either, because you can make everything happen to make him look like a Xerox copy, but you cannot write the words on the heart. You cannot create the person within the body. And so, still, even if we were able to create perfect copies of humans, it doesn't mean that they would be the same people. I've heard some folks, bless their hearts, and their hearts are in a good place who are looking towards this sort of thing. Perhaps for keeping a loved one around, whom in the future, if it was possible to do such things, to keep a loved one around in the future. But they're not going to have the memories, are they? They're not going to have the demeanor and the attitude and all those sorts of things. Why? Because that is individual to the person. The soul that God created and was reared in whatever environment that they came from. So, we ask those two questions. Is it possible? Can they? Yes. But if it's possible, which it is, should they? And the answer, from a biblical standpoint, is no. Because the quality of life would not be fit to a creation of God, and it certainly would not accomplish their goal. It would not remove God from the picture. Now, we've got just a few minutes, about 4 minutes from the time that I usually stop these. Does anybody have a question or a comment, perhaps, they haven't made just yet that maybe they want to raise before we close tonight?
I saw a movie one time about where they had this golden retriever that was a champion golden retriever. And he spent almost about $250,000 to get cloned.
Mm-hmm.
So he would have the heir. Well, as it turned out, they cloned 4 unbeknownst to him. And not one of the 4 was the champion of the original golden retriever.
That's right. Everything on the outside would look the same.
The attitude.
That's it.
Or any of that.
Yeah, that's what would be missing. It's simple to see, even in something like that.
Well, they looked alike.
Mm-hmm.
But there was
Looked like a perfect picture, but there wasn't the gumption. Absolutely. That's a great
There is
point.
one way that God can stop cloning if he doesn't want him to clone.
I see it.
Don't give him a soul.
Mm.
But man cannot give a clone a soul.
No. There's only one source for that.
You know, I mean, that might not be, who knows, I don't know, but that might not be God's will to have humans cloned.
And personally, this is not based on any of the stuff we've studied here, but just generally, I don't know that we're ever going to get to that point. I think the technology exists, but I think it's sort of like other things where I don't think God's going to allow us to step into that realm of things to that fullest extent.
Don't we have enough people and animals in our world?
What's it up to now? 7.7 some odd?
We seem to be pretty
Billion?
good about reproduction.
Like, well, Dennis was right. That's the only thing we've kept perfectly. We don't slack on that in any way, shape, or form, do we? But absolutely.
One thing they can't get around either is, how do our brains work? What makes our brains work? All we know is it's electrical impulses, right?
Yes.
Sending signals down there. How does an animal's brain work?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same, right?
Right.
So what makes ours different, other than it was created to be different?
Exactly.
You can't get around that no matter what they try to do.
We can only dig so far, can't we? We see the electrical impulses. We understand when electrical impulses don't work correctly. I don't use myself as a personal example, but that's literally what my disability is. It is a lack of nerves doing what they're supposed to. The central highway of the nervous system in my body is all messed up. That's what happens. When there's 1 or 2 off, certain parts of your body don't function correctly. Why did that happen? Because there was a lack of the fuel it needs. I was born 2 months early. I came out purple. While you're in that incubator, one intern turns your knob down just a little bit. And that's all it takes. The lack of the proper oxygen. And that was all it takes for that one little, difference to happen, which ends up with cerebral palsy. It is a palsy of the brain. It's cerebral. That's what it does. So God creates us perfectly. And we understand the very basis of how things travel through the body, but they can't answer how to reverse something like mine. Why? Because we only can get it down that far. We can't go any further than that. They can try things like that back surgery I had 25 years ago, where they thought, hey, we'll cut on your back for a little while, try to loosen up some of these nerves so you have a little more function. And I do in some things with my hands, but there's other parts of my body where I lost function too. Why? Because we don't understand it perfectly. And we can't because we're not the source. That's it. So, this is why this is a moral question. Because as this technology advances, people are going to continue to try to remove God out of the picture. If they can't answer the arguments that we've already pointed out in the last several weeks, their only option is to try to remove Him. And they cannot do that with this. Because regardless of what they try with this, they still cannot find a source for the soul. Now, I'm going to stop there and turn things over. I believe Jim has our devotional tonight, and we will move on from there next week. We have, I think, 2 more classes in this. I think that's right, and we will be done with this in 2 weeks. So be getting ready for that. Some more of the videos will be going up here very soon. I'm going to try to get several in. Doug and I have been getting everything coordinated to get that back on a good schedule. And also that 1 week where the camera didn't work, I'm going to record the audio of that and get that up as well. So if you want to go back on the website and look at any of the other weeks that we have studied, the things that we've studied on that, you can go to our website and look at those, and they'll be up there for a good long while for folks to look at as well. So, anyway, thank you for your attention tonight, and I hope that's helpful for you. It's been helpful for me as well.